My name is Jim Doty. I know many of you. I'm the founder and director of the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. It's really a pleasure to be here with you this evening in the continuation of our ongoing Meng Wu lectureship. Before introducing our first speaker, I would actually like to acknowledge the presence of the Meng component of the Meng Wu lectureship. Meng, would you mind standing up? For all of you who know Meng, you all know that he goes by Meng, and he's the jolly good fellow at Google. He's been an incredible supporter of our work here at Stanford, and also a dear friend. And to give him a plug, he has a new book called Search Inside Yourself, and it was on the New York Times bestseller and Amazon bestseller list, and I would highly recommend that. Are you going to have that checked for me afterwards, Meng? Okay. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker this evening. He's going to talk with us about the emergence of this new area of neuroscience called Contemplative Neuroscience. For many of you who know Dr. Davidson's work, he needs no introduction. For those of you who know him, he goes by the name Richie. And in addition to being a dear soul, he's a premier scientist who's really led this field. He received his Ph.D. at Harvard and did the initial work on studying meditation and its effect on the brain, and developed subsequently a relationship with His Holiness. And through that, there was the creation of the Mind and Life Institute, of which he has remained on the board for many years. He's also been a firm supporter and on the advisory board of CCARE, for which I greatly appreciate. He's the William James and Villas Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin. He's also the founder and director of the Weissman Imaging Institute and the Center for Affective Neuroscience, as well as the Center for Investigating Healthy Brains. He's published over 275 scientific articles, edited over 13 books, and just recently had a book come out with Sharon Begley called The Emotional Life of Your Brain. Thank you for the help. It's really been fascinating watching the evolution of contemplative neuroscience as a field of study, and it's certainly, from my perspective, also wonderful to see that the work that he's been also instrumental in developing this area of the study of compassion. It is extraordinary how, over the last few years, not only the study of compassion, but of altruism, has really become a field that is, while still in its infancy, one that is giving us some extraordinary results. We are seeing its effect on the immune system, its effect on mental health, its effect on stress levels, and I think we're going to see even more as this field continues to mature. The wonderful thing at CCARE, though, is that students are now coming where previously they had said, geez, I was told that this area was not worthy of study, that if I actually focus my efforts on this, this would be a career dead end. And I think with the work of Richie and people like him, and hopefully with some of our efforts at CCARE, this has now been a field that many people are excited about and have chosen to focus their life's work on. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Richard Davidson.
Thank you all so much. It really is great to be back at Stanford, and particularly to talk in the Meng Wu lecture series and to be here for CCARE. CCARE is an organization that I really feel very strongly about. I'm thrilled that it exists on the Stanford campus, and the very fact that it exists, I think, is a testament to the emergence of contemplative neuroscience, which I'll be talking about this evening. During the talk tonight, it's going to be in part a little autobiography, in part history of the field, but it will also give me an opportunity to provide an update on research in this area, and specifically I chose examples that are examples relevant to compassion, relevant to CCARE's mission. Let me begin by just showing you this little outline. I'm going to talk a little bit about where contemplative neuroscience came from, where it is now, where we're going, and some important conceptual and methodological conundrums that very much confront and challenge us as we go forward. And I think it's very important that we not bury these problems under the rug, but confront them honestly and openly. And I'll share some of those concerns with you toward the end of this talk. So let me say a few words about the early era. To the best of my knowledge, this is the first paper in the modern Western scientific literature that was ever published on meditation. Arthur Dykman was a psychiatrist actually here in the Bay Area. And this is the abstract from the paper, and what I've underlined is what participants were instructed to do. They were instructed to concentrate on a blue vase. And by concentration, they don't mean analyzing the different parts of the vase or thinking of thoughts about the vase, but rather trying to see the vase as it exists in itself. And they were instructed to exclude all other thoughts or feelings or sounds or body sensations, as if that is possible. So this was where things really very much began. This is a study that probably many of you are familiar with, although probably most of you haven't actually read, since it was published many years ago. But this was the first publication in a mainstream influential scientific journal on the physiological effects of meditation. And it was mostly about autonomic changes, but there were some findings that were included in this report of central nervous system changes. And there were a number of studies early on that followed up on this. This was one of those studies, and this was published in the EEG journal, which is quite a respectable journal, and it presaged the publication of this kind of work in mainstream science. Now, I'm not going to talk about the history of research on transcendental meditation, which this paper was on TM, and that kind of went in a different direction. But let me share with you a couple of other early papers. This was a paper published in 1976, and this is when I was still a graduate student, and I had the great opportunity and honor to work with Dan Goleman, who was a fellow graduate student at the time. And actually, this was in the days before the internet, and I knew about Dan Goleman, and I knew about some papers that he had published, and I'll actually show you a couple of them in a moment. But I didn't know what he looked like. We couldn't Google him at that time. And I went and sat in my first class as a graduate student at Harvard, and I turned to the guy next to me and I said, "You must be Dan Goleman." And it wasn't, anything that is even remotely strange or telepathic. It was simply the clothes he was wearing that were a dead giveaway. He had just come back from India, and he really looked like he just came back from India. So it wasn't hard to figure out who Dan Goleman was in those days. And we became very close friends, and Dan and I served together on the board of the Mind and Life Institute, and actually, we're writing a book together now, which will be about contemplative neuroscience. This is another paper which I'm sure most of you have never heard of, published in a journal most of you have never heard of, called the International Journal of Clinical and Experimental Hypnosis. We actually said something in this paper, and I won't elaborate on it, but I'll be happy to answer questions about it. But what we distinguished in this paper is between altered states and altered traits of consciousness. And we underscored the importance of altered traits of consciousness, which is really about enduring changes that are changes or transformations in our mode of being. And we also stated, in thinking about altered traits of consciousness and its relation to altered states of consciousness, that the after is the before for the next during. And I'll unpack that later if there is interest. Okay, so let me also talk about early efforts at fostering a meaningful dialogue between science and contemplative traditions. And this is the paper also in a very obscure journal, the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology that Dan Goleman published, which was an initial attempt to actually describe in Western psychological terms some critical elements from the Buddhist Abhidharma, which is a systematized description of Buddhist psychology that has a very granular discussion of different qualities of mind and how they may be cultivated and what their relation is among themselves. And this paper was actually a very important paper in the history of research in this area. This was an early version of it. I love this version, which was published by the Buddhist Publication Society in Kandy, Sri Lanka. They didn't quite get Dan's name right. But this is another seminal figure in the development of contemplative neuroscience. This is a picture of Francisco Varela. It was taken about a year before he died prematurely. It was taken in about 2000. Francisco initiated this this notion of neurophenomenology, a project really of neurophenomenology, where we can use the reports, the introspective reports of individuals who have been trained to be familiar with their own mind, which is really what the essence of meditation is, and to use those reports to help constrain hypotheses about brain-behavior relations. And that really is the core of neurophenomenology, which has been at the center of many initiatives in contemplative neuroscience that have attempted to look at relations between first and third person methods of investigation. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the clinical context in the emergence of contemplative neuroscience. And here, the work of Jon Kabat-Zinn and the development of mindfulness-based stress reduction is really important. This was actually John's first paper on mindfulness-based stress reduction that was published in 1982. I met John when I was a graduate student, and he and I hung out together. I met him and Dan Goleman together in 1972. So the three of us go back a long way. About 2 months ago, when I made this slide, PubMed listed 298 publications related to mindfulness-based stress reduction since John's first publication in 1982. And I think it's fair to say that this area of the clinical application of mindfulness meditation has really flourished. So all of this is really a kind of introduction or prolegomenon to a deeper collaboration between contemplative traditions and neuroscience. And a few highlights here is that the first Mind and Life meeting that was a public meeting was held in 2003 at MIT, which was on the topic of contemplative neuroscience. This was followed by the first Mind and Life Summer Research Institute and the establishment of centers like our center and CCARE here at Stanford, which really have been, I think, extraordinarily important in helping to promote this whole agenda. So let me say a little bit about where it is now, and this is really just an excuse for me to share with you some new data. And I'll talk about our own data, but also data from some others that I think is exciting and directly relevant, I think, to the scientific investigation of compassion. So the first topic is about the embodied nature of compassion. And I want to tell a little story to introduce this topic. When I first met His Holiness the Dalai Lama, it was at a meeting at his residence in Dharamsala, India in 1992. And actually, Greg Simpson was there, who's in the audience. And we were asked to give a demonstration, not a demonstration, a lecture to the young monks in the Namgyal Monastery attached to His Holiness's residence. And we thought that in addition to just giving a kind of dry academic lecture, or really in place of that, we would actually give a demonstration. And we had schlepped all this equipment with us to Dharamsala, India, which turned out to be a bust in terms of data collection. So we thought we might as well use it for a good purpose and actually give a demonstration. And so we put an electrode cap on Francisco. We had laptop computers there, and we sort of futzing with the electrode cap and getting everything set up. And during this time, we were in front of Francisco, who had the electrode cap on, and there were about 200 monks dutifully sitting on cushions on the floor. And when we sort of cleared out of the way so everything was visible, the 200 monks just burst out laughing, hysterically. And we thought they were laughing because Francisco looked funny in his electrode cap. It turned out that that's not at all what they were laughing about. They were laughing about something far more serious. They were laughing about the fact that we were studying compassion by putting electrodes on the head. It took us 20 years to actually get back to the heart, which I'll tell you about in just a couple of moments. But this is not our own work, but work from Emory that was led by Chuck Raison, where they were looking at a compassion-based training and looking at pro-inflammatory cytokines in a group of adolescents who were a very at-risk group that they were administering this program to. And one of the interesting things that they found, and this has been something that is common across a number of different studies that I'll show this evening, is that there are some systematic relations that have been uncovered with the number of minutes of practice or the number of sessions of practice. And so here what we see is that the more sessions that are practiced, the lower the C-reactive protein, an inflammatory marker in these participants. These are data on IL-6, a pro-inflammatory cytokine where you see the same basic effect. The greater the number of average meditation sessions per week in this compassion-based practice, the lower the levels of IL-6. In terms of the heart, this is actually an MRI image through the left ventricle, and we can actually get real-time MRI of the heart in addition to the brain, which we've been doing. But using even very simple measures, it turns out that there are some interesting changes that occur in the heart when individuals practice compassion meditation practices. And even more interesting is the linkage that can be examined between the heart and the brain. And so these are data that we published a couple of years ago in work directed by Antoine Lutz. And if you simply look at heart rate, it turns out that there is a significantly greater heart rate during compassion meditation. These are in very experienced experts. These are experts who have spent a minimum of 10,000 hours in formal practice. The average number of hours is 34,000 hours in this group of experts. And they're showing a bigger heart rate response. It's small, but it's reliable compared to a group of novices who were taught the same practice and had practiced for 2 weeks. If you look at relations between the changes in heart rate and changes in brain activity that we examine with functional MRI, what we see, and if you compute a metric of coupling between them, what you see is that during compassion, which is abbreviated CO, particularly among the experts, there is increased coupling between heart rate and changes in the brain, in particular, in this case, in the insula. And we see a similar thing, a similar phenomenon in a region of the dorsal anterior cingulate. And again, it's specifically during compassion, and we see this in a more pronounced way among the experts compared to the novices. These data, along with a number of other recent studies, have suggested that there are important changes in both the brain and the body which are occurring with compassion practice. Another point I want to illustrate with a very recent study of ours is the importance of examining relations between changes that may be occurring in the brain with compassion training and changes that occur on a behavioral measure that may reflect or index the consequences of this sort of training. And so this is a study where we've asked the question whether short-term compassion training can affect the brain and behavior. And in this case, we examined in a true randomized control design where participants were randomized to either a compassion training group or to a group taught a comparison intervention that was legitimately one that we can say also promoted well-being. And in this case, it was an intervention derived from cognitive therapy, cognitive reappraisal training, and participants, when they signed up for the study, were informed that they would be randomly assigned to one of these two groups. Both types of training are training designed to promote well-being. And so this was a 2-week training. We delivered the training over the internet. Participants logged onto a protected website for 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks, which has its virtues and also clearly has its disadvantages. We had the comparison group, as I mentioned, taught cognitive reappraisal training, and they had the identical protocol, logging on to the website for 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks. And for those of you who may not be familiar with this kind of practice, and also even for those who are, there are many different kinds of variations. And what we did in this study is summarized in this slide, and I'll just walk you through this. Participants were asked to contemplate and visualize the suffering, and then wishing the freedom from that suffering for a number of different categories of persons. And we first began with a loved one. So we asked participants to envision someone they loved, could be a family member, someone very close to them. Bring them into your mind and heart and imagine or envision a time in their life when they may have been suffering, and then cultivate the strong wish or aspiration that they be relieved of that suffering. They then move on to themselves. They then move on to a stranger, and by a stranger here we mean an individual that they recognize. It could be someone who works in the same building you work in. You recognize their face, but you know very little about their life. Envision them and bring them into your mind and envision a time in their life when they may have been suffering and go through this process. And then we move on to a difficult person, someone who really pushes your buttons. Bring them into your mind and heart and visualize a time in their life when they may have been suffering and cultivate the wish that they be relieved of that suffering. And then we have them move on to all beings. They use phrases. These are two of the more common ones that we use. May you be free from suffering. May you experience joy and ease. Participants are instructed to notice visceral sensations that may be associated with this practice, especially around the area of the heart. They're instructed to feel the compassion emotionally and not to simply repeat these phrases cognitively. Now, the basic experimental protocol involved randomly assigning participants to either the compassion or reappraisal group. They got a scan before they started the training. They went through 2 weeks of training. They then got a post-training scan. And we also administered several economic decision-making tasks to provide an important behavioral anchor for changes that might be produced by this practice. And I can say more about this task, but in the interest of time, I won't describe it in detail, but it is a version of a dictator game with a third party involved. And essentially, participants had the opportunity to use earnings from the study to redistribute funds between two participants to render an interaction to be more altruistic or fair. What we saw is that after 2 weeks of training, the participants in the compassion group behaved more altruistically compared to the participants in the reappraisal group. And what was particularly important is that when we looked at the fMRI data, what was most important was to look at it in relation to these behavioral changes, because that is what actually helped us uncover certain patterns that we wouldn't have seen otherwise. And so I'll just show you a couple of the findings from this study. In this figure, the red lines are the participants in the compassion group. The blue lines are participants in the reappraisal group. And what this figure is depicting is relations between changes in brain activity and performance on the economic decision-making task. Higher numbers on the ordinate here reflect more altruistic behavior. And what we see is that among the participants in the compassion group, those who activated this region of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex more over the course of training were behaving more altruistically. Among the participants in the reappraisal group, that relation goes the other way and is not significant. And if you look on the right-hand side of this figure, you see the flip kind of relation in the amygdala, where participants in the compassion group who are showing the greatest reduction in amygdala signal are the ones who are showing the most redistribution. So the more negative numbers on that figure on the x-axis are associated with higher redistribution. Those are the participants who are showing a bigger reduction in the amygdala signal. Now, one of the things I forgot to mention is just to tell you what they were doing in the scanner. And what they were doing in the scanner is viewing images of human suffering, and they were asked to deploy the interventions that they received to help decrease to help them cope with these images and decrease their whatever negative affect they may be experiencing in response to it. And so in response to those kinds of images with that instruction, this is what you see. Now, in more recent work, we have been looking at a phenomenon that I've been very interested in our basic research on emotion regulation, which is this idea of recovery, which is something that I think is central to understanding resilience. And the core of this idea is that there are important differences among people in the rapidity with which they recover from adversity. And those individual differences in recovery can be measured in a number of different systems. One of them is in the brain, and we can actually look at the time course of the amygdala signal and measure what's going on in a recovery period after an aversive stimulus is presented. And so here, again, we're using images of human suffering and looking at a period after the image goes off to compute a measure of amygdala recovery. And these are very recent data, and these data just highlight some of the problems in this area, among other things. So let me walk you through this. This is a study where we have long-term practitioners, but they're not super long-term practitioners. These are individuals who've had a daily practice for a minimum of 10 years. They've gone on at least one 7-day retreat every other year or more. And they average approximately 7,000 hours of lifetime practice. And they practice in the Theravadan mindfulness tradition as well as the Tibetan Buddhist Dzogchen tradition. So there's a mixture of participants. And what we are looking at here is the relation between the number of lifetime practice hours in relation to amygdala recovery. And what we see, if you just look at the red dots and the regression line through those red dots, those are the long-term practitioners. And what you see is that the more lifetime hours of practice, the less amygdala signal during that recovery period, meaning the better recovery. However, and here's the dirty laundry, those blue dots are the controls who've never meditated before, and the horizontal line is the mean of that group of controls. And what you can see is that with a lot of practice, these long-term practitioners can get to places that are roughly at the same point of recovery as the most resilient controls, who are at the low end of this distribution. Now, there are many interpretations that are possible of this, and the honest truth is we've not published these data yet, and we don't have a favored interpretation. But one interpretation is that the kind of individuals who are attracted to these practices may be individuals who are quite neurotic to begin with. And it takes them a while of practice to get to a point that is comparable to someone who's not attracted to these practices. That is an interpretation which is consistent with these findings. We've really looked at this very carefully to convince ourselves that these are real data, and we're convinced that they're real. And I think it just, this is part of our practice of trying to be rigorously honest. And so we can talk more about this later. One of the other things we did, however, is we brought these long-term practitioners into our beautiful meditation space in our center, and we had them practice for a full 8 hours. So given that these are long-term practitioners, all of whom have been on many retreats, a day of 8 hours of practice is something that they're quite familiar with and are able to do. And what we saw is something pretty cool. I don't have a laser pointer, but that's okay. If you look in the middle figure here, what you see is the amygdala hemodynamic response, and the blue line is a group of controls who are age and gender matched, And the red line is a group of long-term practitioners after they have completed a full day, 8 hours, of loving kindness and/or compassion meditation practice. The same participants, the same long-term practitioners are in the right curve after a day of mindfulness practice without any loving kindness or compassion. And what you can see is that there's absolutely no difference in the amygdala response between the meditators and the controls after a day of mindfulness practice, but there's a big difference after the day of compassion practice. And there's a reduction across the entire curve, so there's a reduction in both reactivity and in this recovery period. But it's specific to the day of loving kindness or compassion practice. So let me say now a few words about where we're going with all this and some of the research needs. And I want to remind those of you who know about this of challenges that we as a field really face. There was a 2007 report on the health consequences of meditation that was commissioned by the NIH. And I'll actually just show you this report. This was a report that was prepared by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. It's kind of like a Cochrane report. And I want to just read you the conclusion of this report that was published in 2007. And the conclusion was this: many uncertainties surround the practice of meditation. Scientific research on meditation practices does not appear to have a common theoretical perspective and is characterized by poor methodological quality. Firm conclusions on the effect of meditation practices in healthcare cannot be drawn based on the available evidence. Future research on meditation practices must be more rigorous in the design and execution of studies and in the analysis and reporting of results. This was published in 2007. And, you know, things have changed since then, but not a lot. You know, I think that we all can congratulate ourselves on some important milestones since then, but this is something that I think we really need to take seriously. So, and I'll say more about this in a few minutes, but let me say also some other things that I think we need. We need basic research on naturally occurring virtuous qualities so that we can move more toward a scientific foundation for secular ethics, something that the Dalai Lama has talked a lot about. We need research on contemplative practices other than meditation. To the best of my knowledge, there's not a single scientific study, not one, on intentions and vows, which are very much part of contemplative practice and may actually account for some very important behavioral and neural changes. And we need studies of that, and I think they really can be done. We need studies that take advantage of modern methods in epigenetics, where we can look at alterations in gene expression in various tissue that may be of relevance to putative health effects of meditation. And we also need more research on developmentally appropriate interventions and measures. And also move beyond neurocentric research and toward true mind-brain-body integration. There are studies of the sort that I showed you which look at changes in peripheral biology and studies that look at changes in the brain. You can count on one hand the number of studies that have included measures of both the brain and the periphery in the same participants. That needs to change if we're really going to make progress. So I just wanted to show you this. This is a blurb about a meeting that NCAM convened, a workshop that I actually helped to organize. That was a workshop to discuss this 2007 report. And basically, the outcome was a call for better studies and transdisciplinary collaboration, which we are beginning to see. So I want to give 4 examples here. One is about naturally occurring virtuous qualities. Another is a little discussion of intention and vows, a little bit about wild new epigenetic methods, and I'm sure there are people in the audience who know a lot more about this than I do, and so I probably am walking out on a limb here, but I'll do it anyway. And also a little bit about developmentally appropriate interventions and measures, and tell you a little bit about our research with preschool children. So first, I want to just show you this. This was from a paper that was published a few years ago, and this was a study in 6-month-old infants. And these are the stimuli to which these 6-month-old infants were exposed. Okay, now I'll show you this one. Okay, 6-month-old infants. Now, guess which category the infants preferred based on looking preferences, measuring gaze behavior, and all kinds of other measures. The black bars are the helper, the gray bars are the hinderer, and the infants dramatically preferred the helper. These are 6-month-old infants. I think these are very important kind of data because they establish a preference for altruistic behavior that can be detected very early in life. They begin to build a scientific foundation, I think, for secular ethics, and we need more work of this kind. Let me say a little bit about intention, and just to underscore the fact that it really can be studied rigorously and scientifically. So attention and agency can be thought of as emergent properties of the brain. They often precede voluntary action. Intention can also be cultivated to strengthen habits of mind through systematic practice, and this is something that is done regularly in these contemplative practices. And I think it can be accomplished without succumbing to the illusion of a fixed independent self, which is a whole other set of issues. But this is a paper that was published in Science a couple of years ago, and it's a paper about the neural correlates of intention. In this study, which was a study where patients were whose cortical surface was directly stimulated, conscious intention and motor awareness were emerged from stimulation in particular regions, primarily in parietal cortex, which are illustrated in this figure here. There is a neuroscientific basis for beginning to look at this, and I think that we need to extend these kinds of ideas into the domain of the voluntary cultivation of specific intentions, which is something that's just never been done. And I would say that intention, aspiration, and vow are all members of the same family of mental processes, and I think we can formulate a general hypothesis that these qualities can be strengthened by contemplative practice, which can lead to alterations in neural networks that are associated with monitoring and regulation, particularly during situations that challenge the intention. So if the intention is to, for example, cultivate gratitude in situations where there's a violation of that intention, those are situations that I think can be experimentally harnessed to actually look at how the intention interacts with particular environmental contingencies. So let me say a little about epigenetics. These are actually data from a very recent data collection effort of ours. And I just show these to you by way of illustration. This is from a collaboration with Perla Koloman, who is a molecular biologist in Barcelona. And what we did in this study is took advantage of the situation that I described earlier, where we have long-term practitioners come into the laboratory and sit for 8 hours, practice for 8 hours. And what we did is simply look at changes in expression patterns over the course of 8 hours of practice in the same participants. So we looked at, each person was his or her own control, and we were looking at changes over the course of this 8-hour period. So time 1 is when they came into the laboratory in the morning at 8 a.m., and time 2 was at 6 p.m. when they finished practicing. And these are just 2 genes involved in inflammatory processes, and we have a control group who comes into the lab for the same period of time and is equally sedentary, and they eat the same thing during the day. And again, this is taking blood samples in the morning and in the evening, and looking at changes over time. And this is simply an illustration of things that can be done, and there's a huge amount more to do, and it's a baby step in this direction, but I think that there's a lot of possibility here, and this was specifically associated with compassion practice. We did not find the same changes during an 8-hour period of mindfulness practice. So I think that it will be an interesting and evolving story. Now, I wanted to just invite you to contemplate the future, although the future is now with these wild new methods. So we can actually look at human neurons in a non-invasive way by taking samples, for example, from skin and converting those cells to pluripotent stem cells, and then changing that into any neuron of your choice. This is a paper of Dan Geschwin that was published on these methods, and this paper is from Rusty Gage's lab at Salk, which is really a quite interesting paper where they took skin biopsies from schizophrenics and controls, and they used this method, converted those cells to pluripotent stem cells, and then converted them to specific neurons. And they looked at expression patterns in the neuronal stage. And what's remarkable is that they found differences. The C are the controls, the S is schizophrenics. They found differences between schizophrenics and controls only in the stage when the cells were converted into neurons. They did not see any significant difference between these groups, at least for certain genes, in any other stage. So these expression patterns were revealed when the cells were converted into neurons. You can substitute here, instead of schizophrenics, you can substitute a group of long-term meditators, and you can do the same kind of study. It's not, there are many methodological questions and complications, and I don't mean to minimize it, but I simply want to suggest that I think these methods can and should be used, and I expect they will, to probe some of the molecular changes that are produced by these practices. And I want to end with an example of our own translational research with young children to illustrate both how we can render some of these practices to young children in an age-appropriate way, and also the development of measures to actually capture some of these changes that are also age-appropriate. So we've developed an 8-week curriculum for preschool children. These are kids age 4 to 5. And I'll actually end with a little videotape that will show you how this is actually done. Excuse me. This is simply a listing of some of the themes that are introduced each of these 8 weeks. It's a curriculum that includes both mindfulness and kindness practices. There are lots of props that are used. There are activities in which the kids engage. And the intervention goes for 90 minutes a week in 3 30-minute periods for 8 weeks. I should also say that before we bring this to the children, we actually provide a 10-week intervention for the teachers where they get essentially mindfulness-based stress reduction plus. And the plus is an extra 2 weeks that is specifically focused on bringing these methods into the classroom. And I should say we're now doing this in the Madison Public Schools with a sample of approximately 200 preschool children. So this is just a few other high-level pointers about topics that are introduced during each of these 8 weeks. So these are preliminary data from a small sample of 25 kids that are randomly assigned to an intervention and a control group. This is work done by Lisa Fluke in our center, who is a scientist in our center. And this is teacher reports of prosocial behavior. One of the things we administered is an age-appropriate flanker task. So the participants, these are 4- and 5-year-olds, are asked to press an arrow key to indicate the direction that the middle fish is pointing. Of course, the fish that flank it are distractors in this case. They are pointing in the opposite direction. And what we find is that after 8 weeks of this intervention, what we see, if you look on the left, is the accuracy. The blue line is the intervention group. The purple is the control group. Not surprisingly, these participants don't differ at baseline. After the 8 weeks of intervention, there is a significant improvement in accuracy and a significant decrement in reaction time, which is presented on the right. So there's no speed accuracy trade-off here. The participants in the intervention group actually get more accurate, and they get significantly faster as well, which is illustrated in the right. Now, another task that we developed, we call the other sharing task. We obtain sociometric ratings from the classroom, so we know for each kid who their best friend is in the class. We also know for each kid who their least favorite person is. And we get pictures of each of these kids. And so we have 4 envelopes, and we place on one envelope the picture of the child's best friend. We place on another envelope a picture of the child's least favorite person. Then we put on a third envelope a picture of a stranger child, a child that the same gender child, but someone they've never seen before. And the fourth picture is a picture of an obviously sick-looking child. And then we use currency that is really potent for a 4-year-old. Stickers. Makes this work actually among the least costly of research that we do. So we give them a pile of stickers, and we say, please distribute these stickers and place them, literally place them, in the envelope that you'd like to have the stickers go to. And what we see is that before the training, not surprisingly, the kids give most of the stickers to their best friend. After the training, the distribution is completely flat. Now, it's just stickers, but and we don't know how long these effects persist, but I think that this is, for a 4-year-old, this is something that really is meaningful, and we actually distribute these stickers, and we go through a whole process of distributing them so they see them being distributed. So before I end, I want to just talk a little bit about some conceptual and methodological issues. I'll go through this quickly. There's a need for better, more reliable, and objective and valid measures of qualities that we all talk about, but we really have extremely crude ways of measuring them at the present point in time. Mindfulness, kindness, clarity, calmness. We really have no idea how best to measure these. There are real challenges concerning the meaning of these constructs and how they should be measured, and I don't think that self-report measures are going to cut it. This is a paper which, for those of you who work in this area, I strongly recommend to you, by Jerry Kagan, a very famous developmental psychologist, The Meaning of Personality Predicates. And Jerry says, this article, relying on Frege's distinction between sense and referential meaning, suggests that theoretical meanings can change when the reference change, and criticizes the practice of treating personality constructs as unchanging essences that transcend all assessment contexts. And what he means by this is that you can't use the same word, like mindfulness, when it's measured by a questionnaire and when it's measured by a behavioral task. It's not necessarily the same construct. And if you look at the intercorrelations between those measures, they're quite poor. And so this is something really important. We need active comparison groups. We need alternatives to double-blind designs. For obvious reasons, you cannot use a double-blind design because someone who's assigned to a meditation group can never be blind that they're getting a meditation condition. And so we cannot use the same criteria that's been used in traditional clinical trials. So we need to develop other ways of doing this. And we've recently published a paper. Donald McCoon is the first author who is a scientist in our group. Excuse me. And it's the validation of an active intervention for mindfulness-based stress reduction. We spent 2 years developing this comparison intervention. And I can tell you, and it's in this article, on every self-report measure that has been used, with the exception of mindfulness questionnaires, but on every other self-report measure that's ever been used to assess mindfulness-based stress reduction, our comparison condition, which is really a very mindless condition, I can promise you that, but is structurally matched in every possible way to MBSR, and it's matched to the following extent. The instructors of this comparison intervention have the same level of confidence that the intervention will promote well-being as the MBSR instructors. And on every self-report measure, there's not a smidgen of a difference between MBSR and the control condition. Not remotely close to being significant. So it's not a power issue. And I think this is a wake-up call that we need to develop better comparison conditions if this work is really going to get traction and be at the absolute pinnacle of scientific rigor. Let me just end now, really, by just offering some reflections. In the Buddhist tradition, there are these 4 Brahma Viharas, which are virtuous qualities. And one of them is sympathetic joy, which is a wonderful quality to practice at a place like Stanford. So when your colleague gets a paper accepted in science or nature, instead of saying, oh, that's great, that you really can rejoice for them. And this is something that we work with on a daily basis in our lab and center, and we take this really seriously to try in every possible way we can to cultivate an environment where we can actually practice science and practice Dharma in a way which is seamless. Practicing humility. And one of the ways we practice humility is by being really honest about what we don't know, which far exceeds what we do know. And non-attachment to outcome, and the data I showed you earlier is one example. Now, the importance of combining science and practice is going to require entirely new training models, which I'm afraid groups like the NIH are not going to support, at least in the near future. And it means practice time in the lab, what I mean by practice time here is time on the cushion, which is something that we don't think about typically in a high-powered scientific environment. This is our meditation space, which is smack in the middle of our laboratory, which we use on a regular basis, both for research, and we have 2 weekly sittings that are open to folks in our center as well as to others. We, again, try to do our best to seamlessly merge these. Giving graduate students and postdocs time off for retreat. There is a scientist in my lab now who is now on a 6-week retreat, and that's not just okay with me, but it's wonderful. That's something that we just don't have models for in our current environment. We need to have serious engagement with contemplatives and with contemplative scholars and not pursue this work in isolation. We need those folks to help keep us honest and to ground us and help educate us in these traditions. And we need multiple frequent and heartfelt expressions of gratitude. So I want to end now with just a 5-minute video clip that will show you in a more direct way what we're doing with little kids. So, and I should just say that this is the trailer for a documentary film that's being made about some of the translational research that we're doing in our center.
We'll meet you at the next floor, okay?
We have elevators, right? I know that you didn't have a good time in one of them, but your mom and dad weren't in there with you, right? How about you and I will take the elevator one time, and then, but then listen, take a deep breath. It's okay. Do you need a hug?
Okay.
It's okay. It's okay.
There's 2 bathrooms open for you. 1, 2.
We're going to do the elevator.
There are different parts of the brain that become active when we have feelings of sadness and feelings of frustration and feelings of happiness. And we can change our brains for the better.
Breathing in and exhaling, dropping the trunks down. And going.
The challenge for us and Will, the doctor that we met with, he recommended medication for Will. It was...
Clearly ADHD, and he was recommending Ritalin.
And for us to put a 3-year-old or 4-year-old on Ritalin was not the path we wanted to go on. And we're looking at alternative ways for him to bridge his development to get beyond the need for that.
Now we're going to watch our breathing.
Social emotional learning is teaching kids how to be more emotionally intelligent. So teaching kids to take the perspective of others before they act, and being more self-aware, knowing what their emotions are.
So developing sort of empathy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Hey, that was mine. She gave it to me.
What happened, buddy?
Does it feel tight in here? Yeah, put your hand, show me with your hand how it feels inside. Where does it hurt? Where does it feel tight? Right there? And in your throat. Okay, watch me. Put your hand on your belly and take in a breath with me. You ready? Blow it out. Go ahead, tell him how you're feeling when you see him so sad.
Sad.
You feel sad too? Show me where in your body you feel sad.
Right here.
Right here you feel sad in your body. It doesn't feel so good, does it? When you pay attention, what happens to your body? Does it get all busy?
No.
No, what happens to your body when you're paying attention? Quiet. Get slow. You can pay attention on the outside and you can pay attention on the inside. So the first thing we're going to do today is pay attention on the inside. Is everybody ready? This is for you. It's very cool, isn't it? Shake it up really hard, like as if you were really mad or really angry. Now, this jar is like your mind when you're angry and upset. And then we see the angry thoughts settling down.
We can actually be happier people. We can suffer less if we take responsibility for our own mind.
Well, I heard that when you go by elevators, that gets you really, really angry or really upset. Is that true? How does it feel on the inside when that's happening?
Scared.
It feels scared? I'm wondering if we could walk over by the elevator together. Is that okay?
Do what?
And then shake this up when you start feeling scared on the inside. Is that okay? Great. Here, you carry it. Okay, we're getting close to the elevator. How does it feel in your body?
Good.
It does? So I'm wondering, maybe another day, could we take that mind jar with us and take a ride on the elevator? Another day or today?
Another day.
All right. What do you think about that mind jar?
Good.
Do you think that we should leave it at school so that if you're feeling angry or upset, that you could maybe shake it?
It's brainwashing for a good cause.
No, I wouldn't say that, because brainwashing usually implies that the person who is being brainwashed is not agreeing to this process.
Breathing in, breathing out. Breathing in, breathing out.
How about today you can choose one friend and we'll all go to the elevator together. You can bring your snow globe. We can go inside
And do what?
and take a look at the elevator. And if you want to ride, we can. If you're not ready, then we won't go up.
I'll try it. I'll try to ride.
You will? All right, my friend.
Can I hold your hand in the elevator?
Oh, of course you can.
Well, I'm a little bit scared.
Okay. And remember, what does the snow globe do for you?
Make me cool.
Yeah.
Oh, Yosemite.
Of course. And if you feel worried, what can you do with the snow globe?
Shake it.
Shake it up. Yep.
Why?
Okay, now watch this. How does your mind and your body feel right now?
Calm.
Good.
I'll give you a lot of power. I'll give you all the power I got.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This really is the most important slide, and I just want to express my gratitude to many, many people. Antoine Lutz has been a scientist in my lab for more than 10 years and worked on all of our research on meditation, particularly that with long-term practitioners. Helen Meng is a graduate student, and she was the lead on the short-term compassion training study, and many others. Mathieu Ricard has been an inspiration and one of the early participants in our long-term practitioner studies and a collaborator. I feel very blessed to work with this team. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
that we try to do, but I can speak very loud, is actually it's very selfish of me because I get to ask the first questions, so that's one of my prerogatives. But it was a wonderful lecture, and I really appreciate that. But
Thank you.
Let me ask you just a couple things that enter my mind watching that, and some of the thoughts I've had, and I'd like your comment. As an example, we saw the game with the pushing up the hill, but in some ways this is a perception, isn't it? Because there's an assumption that the round figure with the eyes is the good one. Well, how is it that we know, or a child knows, that that's a good one versus the square is actually trying to prevent some catastrophe from happening by pushing down? Who are we to make that judgment of who's the right and who's the wrong?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think that most people, when they look at, if you have adults look at that, most people, if you just showed it to them without any labels, would say that there's a positive interaction occurring in one and a negative or unhelpful interaction in another. I think that most people, when they look at it, would say that in the hinderer case, there's some object which is thwarting the goal of the first object. So, but I think that your question is an interesting one, and I think that we do, I think, casually make value judgments about certain conditions, and I think we need to often think more about it, and this certainly may be such an example. But this is a case where the overwhelming majority of people who look at this, at least in Western cultures where it's been evaluated, would agree with the consensual judgment that one is a helper and the other is a hinderer.
Because one is preventing one from going uphill,
yeah,
and push the other, with the assumption that going uphill is a good thing.
Yeah, in this case, it seems to be the figure is exhibiting agency because the figure is trying to get up, and so it's not that going uphill is a good thing. It's that helping a person, or a being in this case, to achieve its goals is helpful. And thwarting a being from achieving its goals is unhelpful.
Well, without extending this debate on it, I would simply say, though, that one's choice of promoting agency may be another perception of danger. The other question I want to ask you is, we talk about these techniques to promote compassion, these different exercises or interventions, if you will, but is there a place potentially for psychoactive drugs in this field?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and I certainly am someone who is not anti-medication, and I think that the judicious use of pharmaceuticals in the right circumstances could be extremely helpful and important. And certainly some people are, thinking about the oxytocin system in this arena, and there may be some interesting possibilities there. And we know that spritzing intranasal oxytocin will facilitate trust and decrease activation of the amygdala and do all kinds of interesting things. And there may be some possibility at some point in time to develop a pharmaceutical that would help to promote this kind of prosocial behavior. I think if we discover that there's really, and it doesn't have a serious downside, why not?
I agree.
Question, in regard to oxytocin, though, it seems to be, though, that while it may have this very positive effect on nurturing or caring, it seems to be limited, though, to what we define as our in-group. So that may not be the best drug.
Exactly.
But what about a substance like MDMA? Any?
I don't know of any relevant research, you may know a lot more than I do, that has specifically looked at MDMA in the context of altruistic or pro-social behavior. It would be an interesting thing to explore. I just am unaware of relevant data.
Yeah, no, I think there was some preliminary work that was done related to veterans, but the drug has been sort of ostracized for science because of some studies that showed some side effects. Another question, which seems to be an ongoing problem, is all the studies we see, they talk about an effect, but we never see the long-term effect of these interventions, except, of course, in these individuals who've dedicated their lives, who possibly, as you point out, may be incredibly neurotic. But what do we know? I mean, what are the long-term effects? Is it sticky? Does it stay with you?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and I think the honest answer is we really don't know from a hard-nosed scientific perspective. There aren't long-term follow-up studies. One of my favorite New Yorker articles in the last decade was an article that profiled the lives of three people. One was Yo-Yo Ma, the other was Wayne Gretzky, the hockey player, and the third was
Charlie Wilson.
Charlie Wilson, who is at UCSF, a well-known neurosurgeon. And it asked, what do these three people have in common? They're all the best in the world at what they do. And what they have in common is practice, practice, practice. And so, I think that to the extent that an individual continues to practice, we're likely to find longer-term effects, although we don't know what those will be. But often I'm asked the question, does 2 weeks of training, do you see effects a year out? Well, if a person engaged in a program of physical exercise for 2 weeks and then stopped exercising, no one would really think that you're going to see effects a year later. And so I think that this is going to be very similar. But we really do need longer-term follow-up studies, and we don't have them at this point in time.
And could you just comment, and I think for everyone here, your feeling in regard to the involvement of His Holiness in either catalyzing this work or being an individual who certainly seemingly has had a profound effect in this area?
Yeah, I think that it's difficult to overestimate the extraordinarily profound contribution that His Holiness has had in stimulating this work and inspiring a whole generation of scientists to investigate this seriously. In his book, The Universe in a Single Atom, which is a book on science and spirituality, he says in the beginning of this book that if any tenet of Buddhism is directly contradicted by scientific fact, he is prepared to give that tenet of Buddhism up, just to throw it away. That's a remarkable statement from a religious leader. He's certainly more than just a religious leader, but it underscores his commitment to science and to, I think he feels a kindred spirit in the contemplative nature of investigation and in the scientific nature of investigation. And I will never forget when he visited our center the last time he visited, which was in 2010. There were a group of scientists. I think, were you there, Emma, at that time? No, you were there. And so the scientists stood up at the end. These are graduate students, postdocs, postdocs, and His Holiness made a point of going over and shaking every single person's hand and thanking them for what they were doing. And that brief moment of interaction, I think, is something that is still with each of these people and is something that they return to regularly that inspires them to keep doing the work that they're doing. So, and for me, he has been such a source of inspiration and completely changed my life and my career.
And for some of you who may not know, His Holiness actually is the founding benefactor of CCARE here at Stanford, and gave, I think, the largest donation he's ever given to a non-Tibetan cause to this work. So I would like to acknowledge him in that regard. But the other side of the coin is I was having a conversation with an individual about this center who, to put it kindly, was antagonistic. And he said, if you're really interested in doing this research, you should find the person who is the absolute least compassionate person and have him create the scientific constructs and have him or a group like him interpret the results, because you have a vested interest in the sense that you fundamentally believe in this work. And as an example, you talk about the fact that the scientists, essentially all of them, in fact, you sit there and say it should be a requirement that they practice the Dharma, but is that really the case? And could someone argue that maybe you should get people who are, quote, less sympathetic to the cause and, in fact, hypercritical? I only throw this out.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question. I love this question, actually. And, you know, I think it is really important to have non-practitioners and skeptics, and we do have plenty of them in our lab who, you know, are not afraid to, at all, to vociferously criticize, which they do, which we welcome. And we collaborate with people who are non-practitioners. But I must tell you a story, which is when His Holiness was invited to address the Society for Neuroscience in 2005, it created a lot of controversy, and there was actually a petition that was being circulated among scientists who were protesting his appearance. There were about 600 signatories on this signature. You know, the Society for Neuroscience is huge. There are 50,000 members. They had about 600 signatures. The first, about 500 were Chinese and Chinese Americans. And so, you know, we could put that aside for political reasons, but there were, among the rest, you know, some respectable scientists, and some of them who I consider my friends, who signed that thing. I was very instrumental in having His Holiness invited to SFN. And it generated such controversy that there was actually a front-page article in the New York Times about His Holiness's appearance at the Society for Neuroscience that came out a few days before the meeting. And I was mentioned in the article, and my research was mentioned, and one of these skeptics who signed the petition said, you know, and Davidson has actually admitted in public that he himself meditates. And so he can't possibly be objective about this work. And, you know, it's like a cardiovascular physiologist who studies the effects of exercise on the heart telling him you can never do physical exercise for the rest of your professional career because you're obviously, or take someone who studies perception, tell them to stop perceiving. I mean, I think that having, this is not in any way to denigrate the importance of skeptics. And, you know, we try to cultivate a sense of radical honesty and really not being afraid to haul out the dirty laundry. We've published a paper a few years ago where with long-term practitioners, where we specifically predicted a certain effect, and we got absolutely nothing. This was looking at visceral perception, visceral self-perception. And the only difference we found between long-term practitioners and controls is that the long-term practitioners, we had a questionnaire measure of their confidence in their ability to do this task, and they rated themselves as much more confident that they were doing it correctly, and their objective performance was absolutely no different than controls, not remotely different. And that paper was published. And so I think that just by doing our best to encourage this kind of honest approach, and science, we have confidence that science itself is self-correcting, and if a finding is interesting enough, someone's going to want to replicate it. And there are just the mechanisms of science will inherently be self-correcting.
Well, on that note, I mean, there has been some discussion about how these types of practices oftentimes affect vagal nerve tone and thereby have this calming effect and this positive effect. But I've had some discussions with individuals who say, well, if you can figure out a biofeedback mechanism that has nothing to do with compassion or meditation practice to get these effects, is that the positive effect and having nothing to do with what we perceive as these very positive emotions that are powerful in regard to social behavior?
Well, I have a lot of reflections about that. One is that I think it's important that we encourage all kinds of research, and I think research using biofeedback or neurofeedback of relevant biological processes is interesting and should go forward. I think it's important, though, to distinguish that from actually learning these contemplative practices, including when they're taught in a completely secular context, because when they're taught in the way that they're intended to be taught, they're grounded in an ethical context. And this is part of the other pieces of contemplative practice that I alluded to in my talk, such as intentions and aspirations and vows. And grounding it in that kind of context, I think, may be part of the active ingredient, if you will. And we don't really know at this point in time.
I think it's time for questions instead of my questions. Go ahead.
The question is about whether twin methodology has been used in this kind of research. We actually do twin research in collaboration with a colleague of mine in other areas of emotion-related neuroscience. I don't know of any research that has looked at contemplative practices in twins at all. But it would be quite interesting, and there would be some interesting opportunities in that kind of sample. We've been, in other work, looking at monozygotic twins who vary in their concordance or discordance for certain kinds of affective processes like anxiety, which provides an opportunity for looking at experience-dependent changes in the brain. But that's a whole other set of issues.
Just to mention one study that in some ways relates to that is a study with twins in which they actually followed their religiosity. And it turned out that when twins were adopted and they had completely different religious practices, if one of them, though, was religious, the other was invariably as equally religious in a completely different practice. So it's sort of interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe we can get this next question.
First, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
I'm curious, in the beginning you talked a little bit to go over the history of meditation, and I think the definition of what meditation is so important, because you talked about you get a different result if you're doing NBSR, if you're doing compassionate meditation, and yet, if you don't read the studies and know exactly what's being done and how you're defining meditation, we always hear this word, well, meditation was done and here's the result. And I mean, how can you, when you do further research, is everybody going to have the same protocol of what is happening during that meditation?
Well, it's a hugely important issue, and as you point out, there are many different kinds of meditation practice, and they don't result in the same kinds of effects as, I showed you a little example of. I think we just need to do as careful a job as we can in describing what our participants are actually doing and the practices that they're doing, and if, to the extent that it's possible, to also root them in the classical traditions so that we know where they came from and know kind of how they may have been secularized. So, it's just very important, and There was a review paper published in a journal, Biological Psychology, a few years ago on neurobiological effects of meditation, and they basically lumped all these different practices together. It was ridiculous, in my opinion, it so blurred important distinctions, and so I think we need to be very granular in our descriptions.
Yes, sir.
I'm wondering if you have done any studies of mindfulness and healing, especially with cancer patients.
So the question is whether we've done any studies of mindfulness and healing, especially with cancer patients. We have not. So, I think it would be very interesting. There are some people that are doing that with cancer patients now that I know of.
And in fact, at CCARE, we have actually initiated a program whereby we actually train a compassion cultivation technique to cancer patients, at least in terms of testimonials or what is perceived as a positive effect. It seems to have a very strong one, but that has actually not been rigorously studied yet. But I think giving people tools to give them resilience in the face of crises, this perhaps is one that could be powerful. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is about have we looked at the effects of meditation on crime rates if you get enough? This is alluding to a study that was done by the TM folks where if 1% of the population was meditating, then the crime rates were putatively declining. We've not done that, no. I think it's an interesting claim. I'm somewhat skeptical, but I think it's something that someone should go out and do. It really should be done by a hard-nosed quantitative sociologist who knows how to do that kind of research. So I think that the way it was done originally, in my opinion, was not very well done. And so I think it really needs to be done. It would be interesting to do it rigorously. There are other studies of that kind on a more macro level that are also very important. And I'll just mention one. And this is the kind of study that I think is best directed by a healthcare economist. We need to evaluate the impact of regular practice of these sorts of practices on healthcare utilization. Because there's a smidgen of evidence to suggest that healthcare utilization actually goes down. And if that actually is true, and it's documented in very large sample sizes and rigorously, that, in my opinion, is going to be the one finding that's going to be the tipping point that's going to push this over the edge. And every insurance company and HMO in the United States is going to want to jump on this immediately.
And I would tell you that CCARE has been approached actually by a number of these groups. And actually we are initiating some trial programs with healthcare providers in regard to these types of techniques to see if they have an impact. Because I think especially for self-insured companies, as you know, anxiety, depression, low back pain are major expenditures of healthcare dollars.
Absolutely.
And I can tell you from my own practice as a neurosurgeon, most of the people I see with low back pain, which is a huge population of people, it's not in their back, it's in their head. And I don't say that in a bad way, but what I do mean is that for many people, anxiety, stress manifests itself in different parts of their body. And for many people, and for whatever reason, it's manifested in their back. Now, the other thing I find extraordinary, though, instead of having this conversation about potentially practices that can help them that are non-surgical, many of them say, just operate on me and make it go away. So there's another issue that's... one more question, and I think we'll wind up. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. This fellow's been waiting. He's keeps looking at me, and I'm afraid he may have something hidden there.
Well, this is related because you're talking about healthcare. So I was curious, when you were saying you were looking to improve your control groups in these studies and the treatments that are provided to the control group, Has exercise been a treatment, a control group treatment, whereby you've compared it to these meditative techniques?
Yes.
And what are the results of? What does it look like?
Well, it depends what outcome measures you look at, but exercise has been used as a comparison condition in a number of studies. There was a very well-done study recently published looking at the effects of mindfulness-based stress reduction on the common cold, and participants were randomly assigned to mindfulness-based stress reduction or to an exercise group. And in this study, the MBSR group actually fared better in terms of the severity and frequency of colds followed longitudinally over the course of 2 years. So that was an interesting study. So it has been used, and I think that it is one kind of comparison group that would be a reasonable one to explore. I mean, there are all kinds of other issues that using exercise will introduce. If some of the outcome measures that you're looking at are, for example, in the autonomic nervous system, there will be exercise-induced changes in those, and so it makes comparisons a little more complicated, but nevertheless, I think it's would be very helpful. And we know that exercise can do really good things for the brain. There are data at the animal level which clearly indicate that physical exercise is one of the best ways of promoting neurogenesis. So, I think for all those reasons, it would be an interesting comparison group.
Well, again, this brings us to the end of our time together at this meeting. The extraordinary thing about all of this is, isn't it, whether it's exercise, whether it's diet, or whether it's cultivating compassion, every one of them is free. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you, Jim. Wonderful. Thank you, Jim. Wonderful.